Good afternoon, everybody. It is just 3:30 now on my end, so I'm going to go ahead and get us started. Just bear with me if folks start to join. I have to admit them from a waiting room. So if I sort of pause or hiccup in my speech, just know that that's why. It's great to see so many familiar faces, certainly lots of familiar names to me. So putting a face to a lot of you is really exciting for me as well. So thank you all for joining, and I am recording and I'll post it in a Google shared folder that I'll share out later for everybody to access it if need be. So absolutely, by all means, if you need to leave early or do what you need to do to be comfortable, do that, and you can always catch up if needed later. So. For those, I'm sure you all know you're in the right spot, but we are doing our text study on student trauma, a toolkit for schools in times of crisis. I haven't heard that anybody didn't receive their book, so I'm running on the assumption that it's been received and you've had at least some time to do the first assignment, which was the introduction. So if you didn't, no worries, we'll just continue our conversation like you did, and then just do your best to catch up on your own time if there's any parts you missed or need to sort of go back on. I did prepare just a really short PowerPoint just to keep myself on track, to be perfectly honest. So we'll do our best to navigate through there. So for those who don't know me, my name is Nicole Medor. I'm the Early Childhood Specialist at the Maine Department of Education. I've been in this role for a little over a year now. Prior to this title, I was the Early Childhood Monitor, so I was in that position for just over 4 years. So some of you may know me from that position as well. And I also have Marcy on, and Marcy's bebopping from meeting to meeting this afternoon. So Marcy, if you want to unmute and say a quick hello, that would be fantastic. I don't want to put you on the spot, but I'm gonna.
Sure. Hey, everybody. Thanks for being here. I have been in Zoom for all but 1 hour today, except my last meeting, which didn't go well. Sorry, Julie. I'm like, I can't get through. Anyway, it's nice to see you all, and I'm looking forward to this. So thanks, Nicole.
Thank you. So for the rest of you, I'm not going to have you introduce yourselves in this platform the way Marcy and I just did, just for time's sake. But if you wouldn't mind entering just a quick hello and maybe what your role is in the chat box, that would be great for myself and for others to know who's a teacher, who might be a director, who might work in childcare. I know some of us are higher education students, so go ahead and just take a few seconds in the chat box and that would be great. While you do that, I'll just run down a brief purpose of this text study. So I've done this in the past, not with this book. I used a different text previously that was more focused around challenging behaviors in the classroom. And I found it really useful for a number of reasons, but mostly this format was really great because nobody has to come together. It's recorded, you can watch later, read on your own time. So it was a good way for teachers, I think, to get some professional development, some reading, some collaboration in. Also, the topic, student trauma, mental health awareness, was requested from other PD evaluations. So a lot of pre-K teachers, kindergarten teachers in the field in Maine are clearly still struggling with how to sort of include these students, their families, how to navigate trauma in times of crisis, things like that. And a caveat to that, I am not an expert on that. I mean, full disclosure, I'm probably coming to this with the same level of background as many of you, which isn't much. But that's part of the learning that's going to take place for all of us in the next few weeks. We're just going to talk openly, comfortably. You know, it's just one of those settings where sort of anything goes and learning comes from that. I have invited professionals from the department as well as professionals who are national colleagues out in the state of Washington. They couldn't join us today, but I do hope that they can join us in one of our other meetings and add to the expertise of student trauma and mental health. So our schedule is for 1 hour every Tuesday. And then as we get closer to the holiday break, we'll sort of reevaluate where we're at in the book and how much more time we need to wrap up. As you can see, it's not a very thick text, and chapters are pretty manageable. But if you feel like you're falling behind or it's too much, please just let me know. We'll do our best to keep everybody moving through together. Reading assignments will be given out at the end of each video conference like this. So of course, the first one I provided via email because we hadn't met yet, but moving forward, we'll end each session with the next week's assignment, which is basically one chapter at a time, at least for this one. Oops, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to go that fast. Feel free to unmute yourself. I have the power to mute you all for times like this. But if at any point, please interrupt me, unmute yourself, and ask a question or provide a comment, anything. And then also there's the chat box, which I will do my best to try and go back and forth with, but whatever you're comfortable with. And there's always email after the fact if we run out of time and you wanted to ask anything or provide any follow-up, just email me after. And that'll be great. And, in addition to the reading assignments, there'll be questions that I pose to you for each assignment. So that'll be what we discussed in meetings. So that's what I mean by meeting assignments. It's never anything that I think should be too much, more so around your thoughts and reaction to what we're reading. Any questions so far? Okay. I also can't see everybody on one screen. So if there is a question and you raise your hand or something, I might not see you. So also unmute or chat box is helpful. Okay, so one other thing I wanted to point out before we get into the introduction reading was these types of conversations can often spark or sort of trigger some unwanted thoughts or memories or emotions within yourself. So please know that if that happens during the next few weeks together, that you reach out for professional help if you think that that's necessary. So this is just one resource in Maine. It's the National Alliance on Mental Illness, NAMI, and they have a number of resources on their website. They also have a crisis hotline that you could use or share with families or colleagues as needed. And they have a crisis text line as well, if you're more comfortable in that platform. So on every slide down at the bottom, you'll see this main crisis hotline, the text or call number, so that if at any time you want to just confidentially take that down, just know that that's available for you. Okay, so now we have to dig into the meat of our first assignment, which was reading the introduction of responding to student trauma. It was a pretty short introduction, and I really appreciated a lot of things, but I'm not going to take up all the airtime. And you were provided ahead of time with these sort of prompts. So as you read, to be thinking about a time in your own life where you may have experienced a traumatic event. We're not going to talk about what that event was. That's entirely your life and your experience. But I am interested in hearing about how you felt in that moment, how you felt in the time after that experience, and then what you think was helpful for you as you processed your emotions and began to sort of self-regulate. So I'm going to open it up with the first prompt. How did you feel in that moment during a potential traumatic event that you experienced? What were some sort of one-word thoughts? And this would be a great chat box if you want to just sort of brainstorm and popcorn some feelings you had in the moment. I'm going to add mine. Oh, sleepless, that's a good thing. So for the benefit of those that are watching this in a recording later, you can't see the chat box, so I'm just going to chime in with some of the one-word answers we're getting. So we have things like anxious, overwhelmed, sleepless, which is a great one that I think is a common experience we probably all can relate to. Scared, stressed, fearful, that heightened flight or fight feeling. Dizzy. So it's shifting to sort of autopilot. Yeah. Overwhelmed again, numb, anxious, tight chest. Yeah. That's a really great physical description to an emotion or feeling that emotion of trauma. Powerless, sad, scared but calm, stuck, alone. Because it depends on what stage of my life I was in. That's a good point too. So thinking as an adult, the feelings. We'll get to putting ourselves in student shoes, I think, a little bit. So quite a few of these are repetitions of each other, and I think that we could agree they sort of all fall into this section of, there's no one word that can ball it all up, but this feeling of stress and this feeling of helplessness and this feeling of alone, being alone is a good answer, right? Feeling like you're the only one that's potentially experiencing this and others might not be able to relate to that moment. So in thinking about that, how did you feel after? After the event happened, again, feel free to unmute or use the chat box. I know somebody, was it Julie or Nicole, had experienced that afterwards you were relieved. I want to see. So we're getting responses like after the event you felt tired. I know for me, I felt more clear-headed, but was still somewhat confused and wanting answers, exhausted. It was calm, overwhelmed about what might be next, felt stronger. Great. So thinking about those emotions, the during and the after. What do you recall now that we've overcome, might not be the best term, but now that we're past the event, what do you think was helpful for you as you sort of were able to then process your emotions and were able to self-regulate from that traumatic experience? Oh, good. Okay. Tried it quick. Okay, so some of the things that we're finding helpful were support, debriefing, support systems, having something to do or somewhere to go, talking with someone, recognizing the strength in yourself, having friends and family to talk to is a strong support system, having someone to confide in, a spouse or a husband with a rock and help that process to happen, sense of relief. Oh, I'm going too far up. Hold on, let me go down. for me personally, I always sort of put things in like these little check boxes of like a timeline. So it was helpful for me to have the ability to look back and think back over the course of events, what happened before, during, and after that experience, whether it was personal or just sort of as a broad, 30,000 level view of things. That's always helpful for me to move on, and if I experience something similar again, to sort of put those in those boxes. But certainly a lot are talking about the ability to have others, right? To have a spouse or a friend or somebody to confide in. Self-reflecting, yeah. So all of those points, that self-reflection piece, that ability to talk with others, that thinking through the event and having support systems in place, is really that sort of idea of being mindful to a degree, I would say. So obviously a practice of mindfulness is different. However, being mindful of what we just did, how we were feeling in a moment, how we were feeling after time, and what was helpful is this whole piece of mental health awareness, right, within ourselves. So one thing I wanted to point out really quick was this link here, the maine.gov/DOE/webinar library. It is a place where professionals at the Department of Education have recorded and stored various webinars and various PD. And some that I would point you to, and to be specific to this topic, would be that around mental health. There are some for pre-K as well as ed tech, some for remote learning, as well as school counseling and SEL. So I'll just show you really quick what that site looks like so you can access it later. And then I've also in the past looked at various apps and looked at various YouTube channels and YouTube recordings around mindfulness practice, not just for myself, but for teachers to access with students as well. So that's always another great tool to sort of have in your toolbox of ways of managing these stressful feelings or these anxious feelings. So this is the webinar library site, and as you scroll through, you'll see that the topics are alphabetical. And I mentioned EdTech, so there's a large playlist here. But more importantly, I just wanted to scroll really quick down to mental health. So in this playlist, there's a number of different recorded webinars and videos that discuss specifically mental health and trauma. So like I said, I'm not the expert on this, but we do have folks at the department that could provide more information for you. So just wanted to point that out. Okay, so in the introduction, as I read, oh, and I'm not sure if I made this clear. Obviously, if it's not obvious, these books are yours to keep. So please mark them up, highlight, write in them, take notes in them, dog ear them, whatever you want to do. I'm not collecting these back. So as we read week to week, go ahead and do that. And Julie asked the question about if I'd be sharing the PowerPoint and the links. I absolutely can do that. I hadn't given it a thought, but certainly it's something I can do. So I'll give it a little more thought, because what I normally do is just add on to the PowerPoint week to week. So this is our introduction one, and then next week for chapter 1 will just be an extension of this. So think about how I want to tackle that. If the Google folder would be best, or anyways, nothing in it is sacred. I'm happy to share all of it. So thinking back about the introduction, what were some of your reactions to this? What did it leave you feeling?
It's Julie. I think it kind of just made me stop and reflect again on the fact that we are still in the midst of craziness. Like, school started and we're trying to plug along and trying to make quote unquote normal in our home lives. But it's still really bizarre, and we live the bizarre every day, that it's almost feeling normal in a way. But this kind of just made me stop and think, like, these little 4-year-olds are doing amazing in my classroom, but this is still so weird for them, and it's still a traumatic thing that's kind of long going occurring.
Yep. I don't think you're alone in that feeling, Julie. I know for, you know, I can't speak for Marcy, but for myself anyway, being outside of the classroom and not being in the teacher role anymore or in schools anymore, this specific event talking about COVID, because the introduction was very much around the COVID-19 pandemic and the school shutdowns and whatnot. You know, I felt very much removed, but I underlined some pieces in this introduction because it's what I saw from my perspective. So when she said, it's the connections we foster and the ways we support each other that make all the difference, especially in the darkest of times. So that sort of puts into words how I felt last March. So everything, the Band-Aid got ripped off, and our schools and our students and our families all were put in this little tornado. I picture, you know, those little tornado things that we make with soda bottles and the tape and the water and the glitter. That's how I felt like March and April and May were for educators. And for me at the department, and I know some of my other colleagues would agree, we sort of got down to business, and she says that in the next paragraph as well, to start to make those connections. So making those connections with you all has been a goal of mine, but it was harder before because that reason was there, but the platform wasn't. So now that we're all in this experience and having these opportunities, making those connections with you all has been so much easier, to be perfectly honest, because you know, we've been able to provide so many more resources and opportunities to chat like this. But it's something that I want you all to have the ability to do with each other, right? So to start to make those connections. So Julie, for example, I'm going to pick on you again. Julie and Nicole worked together as pre-K teachers in the same school. They have that sort of camaraderie among the two of them. And I only know that because I know the two of you from previous work, but that's not the case everywhere else. So many of our other teachers and directors and administrators are in that role alone. So being able to make those connections now among each other is going to be really important. And it's definitely something that I left. I just appreciated the way that the author sort of put that into words for me. I'm taking up a lot of talk time and my throat's dry. So that tells me that you all need to chime in. So what else were you left thinking or wondering or feeling from reading the introduction?
I think for myself, it's quoted here, the heartbeat of each school is driven by countless relationships and interactions among students, staff, families, and community partners. And I just found that so valuable and certainly relived some of those same feelings from the spring. And as we're continuing on now with an outbreak that we have locally and just trying to figure out, we're in this limbo of what do we do? What's right for the kids? We haven't had a case in our school yet. And, but just, you know, we're plugging along for the kids and sticking, you know, with one another. And I think we've built our relationships so much stronger because we're in it together. And even just like venting, like, you know, they're feeling the same way. And so we've found more of a support within our school too.
Yeah, I'm so glad you said that, Kate, just having the opportunity to vent, that's so important. I know Cheryl in the chat box mentioned after an experience of her traumatic experience, that having her husband to lean on or, you know, a spouse to sort of chat with. In my own personal experience, I don't think my husband wants to hear it, to be perfectly honest with you. I think he has a much different job and a much different experience in what he goes through, especially COVID related. So having a space where you can vent to like-minded folks who are experiencing a similar event as you is really, I think, a good point. Anybody else?
I just would add, it's Nicole, and I do work pretty closely with
Mhm.
Julie. And I do want to add that along the same time that we were kind of initially feeling overwhelmed with the beginning of the pandemic and everything kind of hitting in March and April, just that, and she does speak about it in the book, just being in complete awe of our teams, our coworkers, our administrators. And I feel like, we have been really fortunate over here with Julie and I, with our administration and with having each other to be able to kind of process through this, that we were able to, given not a lot of time and not a lot of initial prep and resources when it all started falling. I mean, we really had no time to prep for it. We really were able to put something together that was, not bad, and got a lot of positive feedback from parents, and people just rose to the occasion.
Yep. Yeah, I saw that in so many places, Nicole. You're right. In the chat box, Sam also mentioned that important piece around relationships, and how she thought that this has brought together a large shift in communication and relationships with families beyond the sort of basic relationship of teacher-parent, but more into teacher and parent as partners, which I'm so happy to hear. Marcy and I will, and along with our other early learning team colleagues at the department, back in April, May, June-ish, we would have these conversations around the irony that we were seeing. So we talk a lot about family engagement versus family involvement. We talk a lot about teaching the whole child and meeting children where they're at instead of where they should be. We talk a lot about assessing children and what research tells us is the best practice for assessing and observing, etc. And we talk about this all the time, well before COVID ever occurred. But after the pandemic, after the school closures, and to Sam's point here in the chat box, it really sort of opened this door to, oh man, we really need to communicate better with our families, because now we don't have their students in the class with us. Now we have to use them as partners in education, because we can't teach or instruct in the block area anymore or at the art center anymore. We can't take them out on a nature hunt anymore. We're relying on families to help us do that. And that's the message we always wanted to send, but it was harder before. And now it's ironic that this pandemic sort of opened up that point, right? And now all of a sudden we're not worrying as much about what letters students know, what numbers students know, what patterns they know, what lines they know, but we're making sure that they have what they need on a day-to-day basis to learn if they're not present, or even if they are present in our settings. So there's irony there, and it's sort of not lost on me. It's almost a blessing and a curse all at once, I guess. So the trick, though, is going to be how do we sustain that when we return to full in-person instruction again. And I also find it really interesting, too, how public school prior to the pandemic was very much 5 days a week. And that was just the norm across the nation, not just in Maine. But with the pandemic and the closures, now we've sort of reevaluated how and when we teach. So providing longer assignment time. So it's not a give, do, turn in. It's a give some time to process the instructions, give some time to practice the learning, give some time to show evidence of the learning. It's just, I think, really interesting. Any other thoughts from the introduction?
So I have a thought from the introduction. I'm not quite sure how to word
it.
But I was very much taken aback on the piece after, when they were talking about, as we were reeling from the pandemic, we took another huge fall, and this time the problem was us. And they were talking about all of the stuff that happened with George Floyd, and the world was, on top of the pandemic, for me, that time in my life was really, really scary. And reading that, it immediately brought me back to thinking about that. And I have a whole bunch of different thoughts about it, but it made me kind of angry to read that, because I haven't forgotten about it. And I know there's still a whole bunch of unrest going on, but it was very blunt and I wasn't really expecting that. And so, but what I was just thinking when you were just talking about relationships and communication is that if something like that had to happen, I'm a little bit glad as a parent on my mom's side that my kids were home with me, because they weren't getting as media, they weren't getting as much talk in school around everything that was happening. And I think that was actually positive. We had a lot of really good discussions about the whole thing. We don't see eye to eye on everything, and that is okay. But so for me, it was like a blessing in disguise. But when I read that, I really was like, oh yeah, I didn't forget it happened, but I hadn't really thought about it in a while. So it kind of threw me for a loop.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to take the quiet as a sign that we've sort of had a chance to talk about this, but certainly feel free to chime in at any other point. So on page 5, there was a figure 1.0, and it was the sources of student trauma. And I have sort of some of my own questions and confusions around this. I just tried to recreate it here on the slide. So of course the center is the child, Zoe's the child. And then on the outside is these bubbles of where they might experience trauma or what might trigger trauma. So they have the self and home, the school, the city, and the state/country/world. So I think this conversation around the COVID-19 pandemic sort of hit all 4 of these bubbles. Because that trauma certainly affected, I speak for myself in my own home, it affected our routine and affected our understanding of each other's own experiences and emotions. It absolutely affected our schools. It certainly has affected our cities and, of course, our state and country and world. But in kind of keeping this figure available on the screen, wanted to ask the question around what challenges and major life changes have your students experienced in the last 5 months in their city or town? So now shifting from our own personal experiences and emotions to that of our students. So putting ourselves in their shoes, what have your 4- and 5-year-olds experienced?
Hi, I'm Brandy. My thing says teacher, but I can't figure out how to change that. So
Okay.
I think for my little guys, my kindergartners, one of the things that I've noticed is they've experienced a friendship loss. So in my classroom, they talk about, my mom says that when this is over, you can come to my house. My mom says that when this is over, we can play together. So I feel like my kids, part of this is they've lost friendships. And not of their own making. These are positions that, this happened to them. It's not something that they made a choice in. So that's something that I've noticed in my own classroom, because in my classroom, and you can probably see it, look in there, I have the plastic dividers. So they still don't even get to have that friendship in class because they're not supposed to get up and wander around. And I'm not sure how much trauma this is creating for them just in this atmosphere. Even though it's a calm, collected kindergarten room, it's their own internal, oh yeah, that's right, I can't reach out and touch them. And that's just been my own experience in kindergarten with kids being told not to share things, and they're being told the opposite of everything that we were originally teaching them in kindergarten. So I think that's going to have an effect in the long term. I don't know if it can be categorized as trauma, but it's something that I've noticed.
Yeah, so you'll have to keep that in your mind, Brandy, as you continue to read the chapters and hear the conversations we have as we go, and seeing what sort of things qualify as traumatic events and who decides the definition of that. Because certainly when we were talking earlier about our own emotions and feelings during trauma for ourselves, without having said what the event was, we all had really similar reactions to that. So I think that's sort of a point to drive home in this as well. Certainly what you just said is a really great example of a loss of friendship, and that's traumatic for an adult, let alone a 4 or 5-year-old, or a kindergarten student in a public school. And they don't have the communication tools to say, this is traumatic. I can't have friends over. I can't go to their houses. We can't roam the classroom and explore activities our teacher has set up for us, right? So that, I think that is a level of trauma for them.
Hi, it's Shirley Jordan. I think that something that they've lost is a sense of predictability because of the we're experiencing a school closure right now. So there's this sense of I'm at school and then now I'm not at school, and am I going to be coming back? So there's always that sense of predictability, and I think that in families that predictability can change because parents have to scramble for childcare because there's no school, or so there's always that anxious feeling of, well, what's going to happen tomorrow, or how's this all going to look?
Yep.
I also
Yep, absolutely.
Children, so I'm obviously not in classroom, so I don't see it on a daily basis. But if there is suddenly less of a sense of safety at school for kids, where we can't, we try to keep them safe and we try to do the best that we can, and I think everybody's doing a phenomenal job. But do the kids, with all of the masks and the dividers and all of the, did they lose that sense of safety that we worked so hard to be like, school is a safe place, you are welcome, you are safe here? Do they lose that a little bit? Or families also, actually.
Mm-hmm.
I certainly think
Yeah,
that
it's interesting. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Kate. Sorry.
I just think that kids have lost a sense of magic and the innocence of the childhood, just thinking along their lines, like their birthday celebrations, or, obviously Halloween looked so significantly different. And we're coming into the holiday season where, for a lot of kids, they're only little for so long. And so it's so sad that they're missing that. And even just like the magic of, doing a science experiment in the classroom, and they all want to like huddle around and see that. And they're like, no, we can't, and they're like, and it's, certainly something we've never been trained, to do or ever thought we would. And I always feel terrible. You got to back up, and, it's just so unusual, yet it is the first experience that a lot of these kids have had in a group setting. And so again, it's one of those things, is it going to stick with them forever? It certainly will in some ways, but yeah, it's just different to think this is their first school experience and that sort of thing.
Right. And I have to believe that that's traumatic for you all as educators as well, because like you just said, Kate, we weren't trained for this, right? We're just expected to roll with the punches. We're expected to take our day-to-day routines that we were doing that were working so well and uprooting it for ourselves and our own routines and planning and setting things up for students. So that's traumatic for us as well, because all of a sudden we were just thrown into this mess that we didn't sign up for, we weren't prepared for. So now how do we take that and maintain some level of that magic and excitement and communication and connection with the students? I thought a lot about that during August when schools were getting ready to return. And we had a lot of conversations around, well, when things shut down in March, we had already had that 6 months or so with students to start to build relationships with them. So having them leave was awful, but at least we knew them as learners to a better degree than we did with our incoming students in September. So I feel like the trauma you experienced as educators in March and sort of settled a little, got all stirred up again in August when you got a new roster of students with no level of relationship yet. So how that occurred was unique for everybody as well. We can stay on that question, but I just wanted to put the next one up as well. So thinking again in shoes of the students, what might your students be feeling as a result of those large scale traumatic events? So it could be COVID specifically, or you could be thinking of a student that has other things as well, like you mentioned, childcare or poor predictability, things like that. So how do you think they're feeling as a result of that?
Hi, Aslan Dubois. I wanted to piggyback on the last question before I start on the next one.
Perfect.
So
Yeah.
I was, the 5 months, the rule changes that they have to adjust to. If adults have a hard time adjusting and fighting about it, because I heard nothing but complaints about a child can't wear a mask for 7 hours out of the day. Well, they're doing pretty darn good. And I'm very surprised when adults can, fuss and cry about it more than a child does. But, those little rules, just before you can go outside and play and have fun, and then just to go into a store, you need a mask on, you need to hand sanitize, all these extra steps just to try to be precautious. And then them seeing adults not following the same rules is just kind of, I would assume, mess them up a little. Like you would think the adults would lead the pack and provide the support that they need to have the children follow suit and do well, but community is not really following, strongly, in my opinion, and not everywhere.
Yeah.
So yeah, the confusion for especially younger ones, because when we first started up school again, I honestly did nothing but preach COVID self-care for a good chunk of time, just to make sure that they understand why we have to wear a mask, why we have to hand sanitize, why we can't even play with our friends or touch our friends or touch the equipment they touched. It was a lot for them, but they did fairly well, in my opinion. And then as far as the large scale trauma, we won't know until they're at least teenagers, honestly, at this young of age, because they don't even understand how to process what's going on. And once they look back, that may stir something, just like in ourselves when we have a trauma. So there's that.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I wanted to piggyback off the 2 points you made as well. First, you made me chuckle. It was so true. In the beginning, the children are handling it fine. It's the adults. But I remember reaching out to schools and saying in the first few weeks, how's it going? Anything we can learn from your experience that we could share with others, etc. And I had one school district write back to me from their pre-K program and say, the kids are doing phenomenal. It's the adults that are struggling with the rules. I'm like, that doesn't surprise me one bit. And then the other part is just, I wanted to mention, and now it's escaped my brain, just shot right out.
Would it be about the community? Like what they see in the community?
Oh, I remember what it was. You made a really great point about in the beginning with your students and continuing to do so around explaining to them, right? So people always sort of have this wrong understanding of that young children aren't capable of understanding higher level topics, right? So certainly they don't have the capability of processing information, understanding information as an adult. However, they are capable of understanding why we need to wash our hands to kill germs, why we need to wear a mask to stop the spread of germs in that way, right? So explaining to them why things are occurring and why we're doing the things we're doing is great. It has to happen. We can't just say, now you have to stand on this dot on the floor and it's 6 feet away from your peer, right? You have to explain why, and they'll get it. And the more we tell them and the more we explain it and the more we make it okay, the better it will be. However, I think all of us are hopeful that eventually we can return to some sort of normalcy, because you're right. The level of effect that this is going to have on our young students is not going to be shown for a while later. It makes me think of when we talk about family engagement, and our Head Start State collaborator, Nina Cunningham, is so good at talking about this. She's so passionate about this topic. But this point of families themselves, mothers, fathers, guardians, we don't know what type of experience they had when they were students in school. And so their level of comfort reaching out, coming to us for resources, for support, or for offering information about their child might not be a comfortable situation. And now here we are asking them to send their children to us in a setting that is potentially so much worse and so much more traumatic of an experience than they did. So it's sort of having this balance of not just assuming that families are experiencing these events in the same way, and just having a sort of understanding that we're all in this together, but the way that we're communicating is different, and our expectations therefore need to be a little different. Some other things in the chat box that were coming in as far as how students might be feeling around the same words we used for our adult emotions: anxious, unsafe, unsure, fear of the unknown.
So I also want to add, I'm thinking about, and it's perfectly fine, but the discussion has been obviously very much pandemic related, which makes sense. It's the biggest thing happening in all of our worlds. We all have that in common. But I'm also thinking about something that is a challenge or a life change just in my community. And I think that it's also important to remember that students and families may be left feeling with a larger sense of community. Because when things happen, people pull together and they try to help each other, and they're, you know, making dinners and, you know, supporting and that sort of thing. So I think it's important to remember the positive side to that too. I'm always the glass half full person.
Yeah. And I think I would argue too that these feelings and these emotions certainly aren't just related to COVID. Young students experience trauma in ways that many adults never experience or can relate to, like loss of a loved one, or separation, or moving, loss of a home, or things like that, or people coming in and out of their lives. So that trauma is very much part of this conversation as well, not just COVID. The third question and the last question for this reading was, I was going to set this up as a poll. Let me see if I can do this. Okay, so I'm going to, let's see. Bear with me, I'll do this real quick. So I'm going to ask a question to the group, and then you just sort of respond to the poll. It's completely anonymous. So all I will see is answers, but I won't know who the answers are coming from. So it was a question around on a scale of 1 to 5. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And then I'm going to add in, I don't know. Oh, I need that. I tried to do this ahead of time, but I wasn't able to figure it out. So that's what I'm doing. Okay, so the question is, on a scale of 1 to 5, how cohesive is your school's trauma protocol? So I believe, and I may be wrong in this, that every public school is meant to have a trauma protocol. I think the question here around how much do you as a staff member know about that trauma protocol? So 1 being, I guess 1 would be sort of an I don't know, I guess. Or 1 is how a low cohesiveness, and 5 being high cohesiveness. I'll be perfectly honest with you. When I did work in the school system, almost 20 years ago now, not quite 20, 15 to 18-ish, I had no idea if they had a trauma protocol, if they did what it said, how to access it, who to call for scenario. And it's looking like that's potentially the same for many of you as well. So that was one part of this reading that when I finished, I was left with the question of, this is interesting, will the book continue to sort of talk about this? Because like I said, I'm not aware of this. I would be willing to bet, and perhaps those of you that are putting a 3 and a 4 on here could chime in, that this is likely a school counselor oversight or creation. Maybe I'm wrong, I don't know. So those of you that are aware of a trauma protocol, anything you could add to that in terms of what it might look like or where you access it? Yeah, so some a change in jobs or switching schools, switching districts, that could certainly, I'm just reading from the chat box from Cheryl, Cheryl could add some confusion or questions around that.
And Nicole, this is Cheryl. I think one of the other things, in certain districts, a guidance counselor might not deal with pre-K students because of certification issues.
Good
So
point.
that's another issue that we deal with. And so from my previous district, the guidance counselor would not see pre-K, but my new district, the guidance counselor is very involved in pre-K. So it just depends on that too. So
Yeah, that's a good point, Cheryl. That comes up a lot in conversations, not just with guidance counselors, but art teachers, health and PE teachers, things like that, the allied art.
but I'm on the committee to change that. So hopefully that will
Good.
be changed soon.
Yeah, so I'm just looking at the chat box too. So it looks like other folks are asked to contact the counselor this year, hiring a social worker. I know that was a popular hiring for sure. Every school should have a social worker, but sometimes it takes things like this to make that more clear. And then finding it in the handbook. So that's a good. I wonder if other schools have it available in their handbooks as well. I'd be curious to see what they say. And I know a lot of schools too share guidance counselors. So even having access to one is fantastic, but they may not always be in the building or as reachable as needed. Yeah. And to your point, Cheryl, around the certification piece, so, this is a battle that we deal with a lot, Marcy and I. Our argument is that if public pre-K is part of your school, then it should have access to all of the things that the others have access to, like guidance counselors, or any other type of RTI or multi-tiered system of support, or 504 plans or IEPs, etc. That 4-year-old is a student in that school, and therefore all policies and procedures should also apply to them. I'm getting off on my tangent now, but we see it a lot in students with challenging behaviors where they're asked not to return to school until something is in place, or being asked not to attend the full programming. So for example, if you're 5 full days a week, asking that child to only come like 4 half days, for example, and be picked up by lunch. That is technically a suspension or expulsion. And in any other grade, that student would be asked to go in front of the school board and discuss their actions, right? So the school board would make a decision around that. That should be the same as a 4-year-old. Can you imagine a 4-year-old going in front of a school board, right? No, we need to be, as educators in the classroom, it's so much easier said than done. I don't want to sugarcoat it like this is your job, but it is part of the situation of reaching out to other colleagues in your school for support and assistance the same way you would with a kindergartner, first grader, second grade, etc. That's my tangent, and I'll stop. Okay, so those were all great points, great conversation. So the next slide is just our next assignment. The introduction sparked lots of great questions, lots of great feedback. So I'm looking forward to the next assignment, which will be chapter 1. We'll plan to meet next Tuesday, the 8th, same time, same link. I'll send it again in an email reminder, but just letting you know that that's all the same. So chapter 1 is from pages 7 to 19. So just read that on your own. It's around the self, home, and Latin trauma. So my understanding is that the chapters will feed off of that sources of student trauma figure that I had on the last slide. So the first one is self and home. So we'll reflect on the students that you've worked with and experienced trauma, not necessarily COVID. And we'll ask for and review any current emergency or crisis protocols that are established at the school. So those of you that mentioned you have it in the handbook or have some type of protocols in place, if you could share those, that would be fantastic. You can, if you don't want your SAU or any specific names or anything, then go ahead and black that out. But anything that we can share with others will be helpful. Any final thoughts or questions before I let you all go? Okay, I like to practice wait time, but I won't then. Okay. All right, I'm going to go ahead and end the meeting. Thank you all so much for coming and chiming in. It's so much better when we get to hear from you and hear about your experiences. So definitely be prepared for that week after week. And I'll see you all next Tuesday.